Thank you guys so much for coming out here. And I want to thank the conference organizers and all the participants in the Literary Spaces and Critical Territories Conference, as well as the Faculty of Arts and Humanities at the University of Porto for this chance to speak. I'm really honored to join my old friend Bertrand Westphal and Alvaro Dominguez as guest speakers, and I'm sorry that I couldn't be there in person. I want to thank Texas State University and everyone here for helping out with this, and especially thank Matt Greengold for helping with the recording, the College of Liberal Arts for letting me use this room, and all you guys for coming. So thanks very much. All right, my talk is titled The Cartographic Imperative. In his poem titled Brief Thoughts on Maps, the Czech poet Miroslav Holub relates the story of a Hungarian reconnaissance unit hopelessly lost in a snowstorm in the Alps during World War I. As the poem acknowledges in its first line, this itself is a retelling of a tale formerly told by Albert Szent-Györgyi, the winner of the 1937 Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine. In that story, we see that the Hungarian troops are at the brink of despair, lost in this snowstorm. At last, resigning themselves to death, they find a map that one soldier had kept in his pocket, and using it to locate their bearings, the troops managed to make it safely back to camp. There, the commanding officer, who had been racked with anguish and guilt over the loss of his troops, asked to see this miraculous map that had saved their lives. A soldier handed it over, and it was revealed to be a map, not of the Alps, but of the Pyrenees. The moral of the story appears to differ among its tellers. Szent-Györgyi's point in originally recounting the anecdote was to show that in science, even errors or false starts can lead to success. Holub's broader intention in retelling the tale, however, may have been to show how, in the words of the poem, quote, life is on its way somewhere or another, regardless of one's sense of orientation. The map, even the wrong map, can aid us in getting where we need to go. Another less philosophical lesson might be simply, always carry a map. Or, in a slight variation on this, always map. This injunction makes itself felt most urgently, perhaps, in situations in which one is lost, desperately seeking guideposts or markers that can identify one's place in relation to other places. To call for a map or to demand that someone engage in mapping is to recognize one's own disorientation, one's displacement in space, or one's loss of a sense of place, which is undoubtedly alienating, if not also terrifying. The spatial anxiety associated with being lost, somewhat like the angst that accompanies the existential condition, according to both Heidegger and Certeau, brings with it a visceral awareness of place and space, which might otherwise be taken for granted or left safely tucked away in the unconscious. The sudden need to map, or at least to have access to a map, propels to the fore that topophrenia that remains with us at all times, a place-mindedness that characterizes the subject's interactions with his or her environment. This is itself so broadly conceived as to include the lived space of any given personal experience, the stroll about the shopping mall, for example, as well as the abstract space whose true representation is beyond any one individual's ken, a larger national, international, or universal space, the world system, and so forth. But although it may be experienced most keenly in those moments of disorientation, the fact is that persistent place-mindedness, as well as the need to map, are constant features of arguably human existence. Topophrenia characterizes nearly all human activity, as a sense of place is an essential element of thought, experience, and being. This is equally true of matters of displacement and replacement, of movement between places and over spaces, and of the multifarious relations among place, space, individuals, collectivities, events, and so on. To think of a place is already to be mapping. This cartographic imperative lies at the heart of the spatial imagination. We are always mapping whether we are aware of it or not. Speaking of cognitive mapping, in an era of globalization, an activity understood in part as the self-conscious attempt by individual or collective subjects to represent and situate themselves in relation to an unrepresentable social totality, Frederick Jameson has asserted that it is not merely the case, quote, that we ought to strive for it, but that we do so all the time anyway without being aware of the process. We do so through figures and narratives that carry diverse, even contradictory meanings, but that also operate as the means by which we make sense of the world we occupy and imagine. In this manner, again, we're always mapping. The term must be understood figuratively, of course, but then the map is already a figure. It provides a figurative or figural representation of the spaces and places it depicts, and this representation is more or less useful for a variety of purposes to those who employ it. In this way, as a number of spatially oriented critics have long asserted, mapping may be seen as an activity not unrelated to literary production. Both practices, mapping and storytelling, organize and coordinate the various data of experience and abstract projections or structures in which, structures in such a way as to constitute a meaningful ensemble, a self-contained whole, if only provisionally and temporarily, which can then be used to make sense of or give form to the world as we then can know it. These become ways of orienting ourselves, of establishing a sense of place in relation to other spaces and places, and ultimately of envisioning a somewhat coherent image of the various spatial and social frames of reference, from small-scale interior design to ever larger scales of region, nation, and planet, up to and including the world system as a whole. Perhaps it ought to go without saying that in this talk, the map needs to be understood as a metaphor, but is no less powerful for being metaphorical. Indeed, I would say that it is only just metaphorical, since the spatial imagination, which is both the motive and the basis for the project of literary cartography, is necessarily connected to the so-called real spaces, to geography and to architecture, for instance, as well as to the imagined spaces that constitute the figurative vision of the world, whether conceived of in terms of the social sphere, planet, universe, or other abstract forms. Hence the value of Edward Soja's trialectical approach to the conception, perception, and experience of space that posited what he called the real and imagined places as the true object for analysis. Soja conceives of third space, which he writes as one word, third space, as a way not only to bridge, but to transform and other, as he calls it, the divide between physical and mental spaces, which is to say between the so-called real geography out there and the representations of space we carry in our minds, first and second space, respectively. In Soja's view, quote, everything comes together in third space. Subjectivity and objectivity, the abstract and the concrete, the real and the imagined, the knowable and the unimaginable, the repetitive and the differential, the structure and agency, mind and body, consciousness and the unconscious, the disciplined and the transdisciplinary, everyday life and unending history, end quote. This holistic view of spatiality informs my sense of what I'm calling topophrenia. It also informs the projects of literary geography in narrative practice and geocriticism in reading, since the spaces and places involved must also be considered in their persistently real and imagined states. If mapping be partly metaphorical, therefore, it still has its literal force in the fact that spatiality is a fundamental aspect of our own being, like temporality. Moreover, although it can't be denied that a certain cartographic imperative or mapping project lies at the heart of human experience and aesthetic representation across different historical moments, it does seem to me, following the lead of Henri Lefebvre, among others, that different historical and social formations have produced distinctive spatial organizations which in which case certain times and places have likely called for a greater attention to or awareness of various problems of spatial representation or orientation than others. Consequently, levels of what might be thought of as cartographic anxiety, to use Derek Gregory's term, may vary depending on one's historical, social, and spatial situation, and the need to produce figural maps may thus be more or less urgent. For a variety of reasons, I follow such thinkers as Michel Foucault, plus Lefebvre, Soja, and Jameson, among others, in recognizing that ours is an epoch of enhanced spatiality. The so-called spatial turn in the humanities and social sciences in recent years is partly the result of this heightened sense of the importance of space, place, and mapping to those fields in late 20th or early 21st centuries. If Jameson has conceded that his notion of cognitive mapping was really a code word for class consciousness and a fundamentally modernist strategy, it was nevertheless to be understood as a form of consciousness especially suited to, quote, that new spatiality implicit in the postmodern. One might also cite the radical and political economic transformations associated with the epoch of globalization, which in some ways, and in particular with its characteristic space-time compression, as David Harvey famously pointed out, stands as a parallel to the postmodernism as a cultural dominant. Cognitive mapping in this era ties together the existential situation of the subject and the crisis of representation in the arts, together with the material, social, and economic conditions of the present system. As Jameson went on to note, the figure of cognitive mapping retains, quote, the advantage of involving concrete content, imperialism, the world system, subalternity, dependency, and hegemony, while necessarily involving a program of formal analysis of a new kind, since it is centrally defined by the dilemma of representation itself, end quote. Indeed, whether the map be considered as a literal form or a figure for a sort of narrative representation I have in mind in my use of the term literary cartography, the flexibility and effectiveness of mapping make it an exemplary model for literary and cultural studies, if not for the humanities and social sciences tout court. That our experience of the world and the language we use to describe it can be considered distinctively spatial as well as temporal is not really contested. All stories are spatial in one respect or another, and more often than not in many different ways at once. My interest in narrative is no doubt based partly on my own professional formation in the discipline of literary studies. But I also believe that there's a fundamental relationship between narrative and our engagement with the world at an epistemological as well as aesthetic level. That is, inasmuch as humans are political animals in Aristotle's definition, we're also storytelling animals. And I here follow Jameson again in viewing narrative as, quote, the central function or instance of the human mind. This is also related to the cartographic imperative, insofar as our comportment towards the world is necessarily topophrenic, so our narratives help to shape the spaces and places we perceive, experience, and inhabit. The trailblazing linguistic research of Charlotte Lind and William Laboff in the 70s demonstrated the degree to which our perception and utterances were guided by distinctive ways of imagining space, place, and our relationships with them. In Spatial Networks as a Site of the Study of Language and Thought, Lind and Laboff famously distinguished between the tour and the map. The former establishes a sort of spatio-temporal narrative, which involves a subject who moves through space in a certain sequential order or syntax, whereas the latter postulates a synoptic or synchronic spatial organization in which everything is laid out at once. Looking at various ways that the residents of New York describe their apartments, as their example, Lind and Laboff note the manner in which their speech functions so as to offer a sort of guided tour of the apartment. For example, quote, you enter the kitchen and then you find a dining room to your left. essentially narrating a spatial story of the environment for the auditor or reader. Only rarely do Lind and Lebel find the New Yorkers employing a more map-like or objective discourse. For example, quote, "There is a dining room to the left of the kitchen." The linguists thus conclude that the tour takes priority over the map, the former being more vital, suggestive of lived experience and movement, while the latter somewhat arid, bloodless abstraction. However, I would argue that the dynamic movement of the tour and the static description of the map present something of a false dichotomy, since in reality both features are present in any given narrative scenario. The subject's movement through space and among places, and his or her perceptions of them, presupposes and is informed by a more abstract or theoretical vision of a non-subjective or suprasubjective image, a bird's eye view that brings order or a sense of objectivity to the limited view of the itinerant subject. What is more, both of these ways of describing space and place are actually cartographic, since the tour also registers locations and their relationships with one another in an imagined space, and the map need not be considered a merely static representation made available abstractly from the view from nowhere. Each is informed by a spatiotemporality, even if the spatial appears to be more emphatic in the map-like description, and the temporal seems highlighted in the movement of the tour. The tour map distinction is still valuable, as it illuminates two fundamental aspects of the spatial imagination, which in the older discourse of philosophy might simply be transcoded as subjective and objective. And yet, as with the long history of this dialectic in philosophy, we find that the two registers cannot long be held separate and distinct, as each infuses the other and makes knowledge, and more importantly, narrative, possible. In his analysis of this distinction between the map and the tour, part of a broader discussion of spatial stories, Michel de Certeau notes the oscillation between the alternate terms, quote, "either seeing the knowledge of an order of places or going, spatializing actions," end quote. He then uses this distinction to inform another, in the context of narrative, between the itinerary and the map. In this vision, the itinerary represents, quote, "a discursive series of operations," whereas the map offers a plain projection, totalizing observations. And de Certeau sees these as two distinctive, quote, "symbolic and anthropological languages of space." While I agree with the significance of the distinction, which in my view comports with the other productive alternatives in literary and social theory, I think, for example, of narrative versus description, to cite Georg Lukács, or the class struggle versus mode of production in Marx, or simply, as noted above, subjectivity versus objectivity more generally, I cannot accept de Certeau's conclusion that the one, itinerary or tour, is somehow more liberatory or transgressive, while the other, the map, is hegemonic and repressive because totalizing. In fact, as I just said, the two registers inform one another, at times mutually reinforcing and at others disjointedly challenging the representations produced in accordance with them. As Jemison observed in his well-known digression on cartography in his original postmodernism essay from 1984, itineraries are basically, quote, "diagrams organized around the still subject-centered or existential journey of the traveler," whereas mapping proper will require, quote, "the coordination of existential data, the empirical position of the subject, with unlived abstract conceptions of the geographic totality." Moreover, the seemingly subjective perspectival itinerary and the apparently more objective speculative or projective map will each necessarily encounter the fundamental problem of representation as such. For, as Jemison observes, and all modern cartography affirms, quote, "there can be no true maps." With no true maps, with no perfectly mimetic representations of the depicted places and spaces, no God's eye view or absolute truth upon which to rely, we are left with, but we are also blessed with, the task of creating, revising, polishing, perhaps discarding than producing anew our own figural representations. This means better maps are possible, and that what we mean by better is not simply more accurate, but better for our own purposes, better suited to its use and to its users. But this is the case for a formal practice of map making. It's also the case for those of us who find ourselves in need of orientation at a given moment, whether we're trying to find a new restaurant in a shopping center or a military encampment in the Alps. And then, again, it's not merely the case that we ought to make the effort to map these spaces, but that we do so all the time. Again, this is the cartographic imperative. The cartographic imperative lies at the heart of literary cartography as well, for it is through narrative that this figural map-making, broadly conceived, takes place. Narrative also makes place, establishing relations among places and assigning various levels of significance to different spaces and places. And as an aside, I'll add, this is not to say that non-narrative writing could not also produce literary cartography, and poetry, especially given its spatial form, has frequently been a subject for spatial literary studies. However, in my view, literary cartography is best executed through narrative for the reasons I've discussed elsewhere, but fundamentally because the narrative maps are more readily visible as dynamic processes or mobile constellations than as static images. This goes back to the tour versus the map distinction that I tried to explode. Of course, poems like Holub's, which tell stories, combine the sound and sense of poetry with a narrative trajectory, thus also forming a figurative map. In identifying places, delineating relations among them in space, connecting some while disconnecting others, aggrandizing the importance of some and diminishing that of others, and so on, we're drafting various maps and telling different stories. As Peter Turchi puts it, quote, "To ask for a map is to say, tell me a story," to which might be added, and vice versa. My work mostly examines literary cartography, and my approach to the subject is accordingly that of a literary critic. Some of my readers have asked me why I don't include actual maps or other spatial diagrams in any of my writings on the subject, and my answer is in part that literary cartography, strictly speaking, is undertaken and accomplished through literature, understood here in its narrow yet still broad etymological sense as covering the written word. I'm not at all suggesting those spatially oriented critics who do employ maps or other graphics, whether as illustrations, models, or tools, are doing anything wrong, and indeed I've benefited immensely from their projects, just as I've benefited from the work of professional geographers, urbanists, art historians, and others. Nevertheless, I do find there to be a certain tension, perhaps a more or less productive rivalry, between text and image, narrative and picture, that can sometimes confuse the issue by causing readers either to conflate one with the other or to feel the need to take sides. One inevitably compares or contrasts the map created and presented in the language of a text, literary cartography, with the visualization of the imaginary space in the map or the diagram. In texts that include maps, which are almost always quite helpful to the reader, one might well question the authority of the text relative to that of the accompanying image, or rather, if the authority is not questioned, then the different registers may be said to produce different sorts of maps, maps that may be equally authoritative, but which cannot help to produce distinctive effects. This can lead to productive controversies, but it can also take away from the literary text itself and push us into another zone of inquiry. The spatial humanities, quite rightly, involve interdisciplinary approaches to their areas of inquiry. Whether we name these practices geocriticism, literary geography, the spatial humanities, or whatever, researchers engaged in such work inevitably find themselves working amid the fields of history, literature, philosophy, religion, art and art history, urban studies, architecture, social theory, political economy, sometimes archaeology or geology, even physics or mathematics, and of course geography, again, among even others. Much of the innovation and excitement in the spatial humanities comes from these productive interactions across disciplinary boundaries. And yet, I would caution against seeing interdisciplinarity itself as a wholly salubrious phenomenon or an inherently worthy goal. As much as we might value the fruitful collaborations with our peers in other departments, we must also recognize the degree to which disciplinary conventions and practices, while arbitrary in a purely ontological sense, have developed historically and instantiated themselves within structures of scholarly activity that themselves have value. It is enough to note that philosophers, geographers, and literary critics do not approach their subjects in the same ways. But I would also observe that we do a disservice to ourselves and to our colleagues by too eagerly aligning the differences between our disciplinary fields. Interdisciplinary scholarship has yielded significant results, but the distinctive power and effectiveness of certain practices within the disciplines ought not to be disregarded entirely. For my own part, I tend to maintain an approach that is very much based in literature as a disciplinary field, with literary criticism, literary theory, literary history understood as key subdivisions of that field. This is not to say that my approach is superior to that of a philosopher, geographer, historian, or other, but only that the perspective of literary studies is itself somewhat distinct. In addition to my own comfort level in the field for which my own scholarly training prepared me, I would say that three other considerations have led me to conclude that the literary approach is the right one for this study. First, there's Yi-Fu Tuan's famous definition of place with respect to space, by which he positions the former squarely within the disciplinary bailiwick of literary studies. That is, a place is understood by Tuan to be discernible portion of space that is endowed with meaning and subject to interpretation. And literary criticism, among other fields, takes interpretation along with analysis and evaluation to be central to its mission. I maintain that interpretation in one form or another remains a crucial element of literary criticism or of literary studies in general, even as this view has come under increasing attack in recent years by advocates of a post-critical approach to literature. But in any event, at one level, the apprehension and analysis of place are exercises in reading. Second, as Jameson has pointed out, literary studies, in its focus on language and its attention to the need to interpret, prepares us to deal with the complexities of our current condition. And this is a quote from Jameson's The Political Unconscious. Quote, "Unfortunately, no society has ever been quite so mystified in quite so many ways as our own, saturated as it is with messages and information, the very vehicles of mystification, language, as Talleyrand put it, having been given us in order to conceal our thoughts. If everything were transparent, then no ideology would be possible and no domination either. Evidently, that is not our case. But above and beyond the sheer fact of mystification, we must also point to the supplementary problem involved with the study of literary and cultural texts, or in other words, essentially of narratives. For even if the discursive language were to be taken literally, there is always and constitutively a problem about the meaning of narratives as such." End quote. Needless to say, perhaps, that a literal interpretation is still a kind of interpretation, as literary texts and the language of which they are made do not simply conform to an objective set of facts, but require ways of reading. The narrative maps produced through literary cartography are equally subject to hermeneutic investigation, even as they serve as a means by which to interpret the underlying spaces and places they endeavor to represent. And third, I cite Northrop Frye's impassioned defense and presentation of literary studies as a means of educating the imagination. If the study of literature can educate and empower the imagination, then the spatially oriented study of literature focused upon literary cartography and geocritical inquiry, along with the literary approach to space and place, can only strengthen the spatial imagination, a faculty all the more desirable for making sense of our place and our world today. The most significant of these repeated points is the fundamental observation, drawn again from Tuan, among others, that place is constructed or created as a locus of meaning, and that it is subject to interpretation, and that the representation of place, broadly imagined, necessarily brings with it a literary sensibility. As a unit of literary cartography, place is crucial to the project of narrative mapping and to the more generalized spatial imagination. And at the risk of implicating myself in a circular argument, I return to the idea of the cartographic imperative, since the notion of place as a site of interpretation is another way of saying that it needs to be mapped. That is, in various ways, a sort of figurative mapping is the necessary and unavoidable aspect of our being in the world. If, as I maintain, all narratives may be taken as forms of literary cartography, it is in part because this ineluctable topophrenia is at the core of what used to be called the human condition. In telling stories, we orient ourselves and others with respect to place and space, not to mention moments in time, and we produce dynamic, multiform, and protean cartographies. A geocritical approach to reading these narrative maps enables us to sense more emphatically the ways that space, place, and mapping condition our lives, attitudes, thoughts, and experiences, as well as our far more distant claims to knowledge about them. As Frank Kermode once said, it is not for critics to help us make sense of our lives, that is the burden of poets and other creative writers, but merely to attempt the lesser task of, quote, making sense of the ways that we try to make sense of our lives. In our time, after the spatial turn, geocritics, spatially oriented critics, and others working in the spatial humanities can offer new interpretations, analyses, and evaluations of these ways of making sense, and paying particular attention to the spatial imagination, we may come to see the world and ourselves in interesting new ways. By engendering novel perspectives, geocriticism and other spatially oriented approaches have opened up alternative vistas, which in turn may help to create spaces for critical inquiry in the future. The study of literary spaces inevitably requires the invention and reinvention of ever more imaginative cartographies. Indeed, if the maps we create or consult turn out to be maps of the Pyrenees when we had thought we were exploring the Alps, we may still find our way home, but we will more likely only do so after having many extraordinary transformative experiences in the meanwhile. Mapping is, after all, part of the adventure. Thank you.